Imagine a medieval count who, on a Tuesday, publicly ties his own wife to a stake, lights the fire himself, and with a face of stone, watches as she burns to ash. Then, on Wednesday morning, that same man strips himself bare, tears his own back to shreds with a whip, and begins a 2-year walk, barefoot, to Jerusalem to pray for the soul of the woman he just murdered. This was not a one-time act of madness. It was a cycle of horrific sin and brutal repentance that defined his entire life, and the shocking reason he did it would remain a secret for 700 years, hidden in his grave. On the 1st of May in the year 1001, the midday sun beat down upon the market square of Angers. A great silence held the air, a heavy blanket smothering the usual sounds of the city. The people stood in a dense, motionless ring, their faces turned inward toward the center of the square, their eyes fixed upon the grim stage set before them. Count Fulk Nerra, whom men called the Black, stood apart from the crowd. He was a figure carved from granite and old grievances, his face a map of countless battles. No emotion creased his features, his eyes were chips of flint, reflecting the harsh sunlight without warmth. He was a statue of judgment, his presence alone commanding the unnatural stillness of the day. The focus of every gaze was the woman tied to the stake. It was Elizabeth, his wife. Her hair, the color of spun honey in the summer sun, was unbound and stirred by a faint, hot breeze. Her head was tilted back, her eyes fixed on the vast, empty blue of the sky, as if seeking an absolution that the world of men had denied her. Her white shift was a stark contrast to the dark wood. A servant, his face pale and his hands trembling, broke the tableau. He moved with shuffling steps toward the count, bearing a single torch. The flame writhed in the bright daylight, a small, hungry thing of orange and red. Fulk took it without a word, his grip firm and steady. The servant scurried back into the anonymity of the crowd, his duty done. The count moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace. He stepped to the base of the pyre, a carefully constructed mound of dry straw and seasoned kindling. He lowered the torch. There was a soft hiss, a whisper of ignition, as the flame licked at the tinder. A thin curl of white smoke was the first to rise, a ghostly serpent ascending into the still air. The fire did not hesitate. It consumed the straw with a ravenous crackle, leaping eagerly onto the heavier branches of the pyre. What began as a whisper grew swiftly into a roar. A wave of heat washed over the nearest ranks of the crowd, forcing them back a step. The flames climbed, a solid wall of churning orange, enveloping the base of the stake. Soon, the lower half of Elizabeth's form was obscured by the swirling conflagration. The smoke thickened, turning from white to a greasy, choking black that stained the perfect sky. The clean scent of burning wood was now tainted by something else, a sharp, acrid odor that caught in the back of the throat and spoke of a terrible alchemy. Fulk did not move. He stood rooted to his spot, a lone sentinel before the inferno he had created. He breathed deeply, drawing the bitter smoke into his lungs as if it were incense. His gaze never left the pyre, watching the transformation with an unblinking intensity. This was not merely an execution, it was a sacrament, a purification by fire he himself had ordained. The collective breath of the crowd was held in 1,000 chests. They watched in a state of horrified fascination, their fear of the count warring with the gruesome spectacle. No one wept, no one protested. To challenge Fulk Nerra was to challenge fate itself. They were merely witnesses to the terrible turning of his will, as immutable as the seasons. With a great groaning crash, the heart of the pyre collapsed inward, sending a shower of sparks and embers high into the air. The flames surged with renewed fury, a pillar of fire that seemed to lick at the very sun. The human shape was gone, lost to the elemental rage. The central post, now a column of glowing charcoal, stood silhouetted against the blaze. As the fuel was consumed, the fire's roar began to subside. The towering flames shrank back, their dance becoming slower, less frantic. They clung to the charred wood, turning the blackness to a pulsing, malevolent red. The intense heat lessened, and the sound became a steady, rhythmic crackling, the death rattle of the fire. For a long time, Fulk remained. He watched as the last of the embers faded from red to a dull gray, their light extinguished. The sun had begun its slow descent in the western sky, casting long shadows across the square. The place where his wife had stood was now just a mound of ash and blackened wood, cooling in the late afternoon air. A sudden gust of wind swept across the silent square. It stirred the pile of grey dust, lifting the finest particles into the air. The ashes of Elizabeth, light as memory, swirled for a moment before dispersing over the cobblestones and rooftops of Angers. Only then did the Black Count turn his back on his work and stride away, his face as empty as the sky. The 2nd of May began in a darkness deeper than night. Long before the first hint of dawn, while the castle of Angers lay entombed in sleep, a single shadow detached itself from the stone. Count Fulk moved with a ghost silence, a spectre in his own domain, leaving behind the warmth of his bed and the spectre of his power. He passed through the silent halls, his bare feet meeting the cold flagstones. Each step was a deliberate disavowal of his station, a casting off of the men he had been only a day before. At the postern gate, he did not command the guards but drew the heavy bolt himself. The groan of the iron was the only sound in the sleeping world. Beneath his plain woolen tunic, a hair shirt was a torment against his skin. The coarse, stiff fibers bit into the raw flesh of his back, a latticework of weeping wounds left by the scourge he had wielded against himself throughout the long night. Pain was his only companion now, a constant, holy reminder of his sin. The gate closed behind him with a final, echoing thud. He was outside, a man unmade. The dusty road of Anjou stretched before him, pale in the pre-dawn gloom. He took his first step as a penitent, and then another. There was no looking back. The world he had commanded was now a place he must traverse as the lowest of men. His path lay east, a line drawn across the map of the world toward the one place where forgiveness might be found. The Holy Land, a destination so distant it was more an idea than a place. Jerusalem was the name he whispered to himself, a prayer and a sentence. He walked to wash his soul clean of the fire and the ash. He sought the Lord's pardon for the soul of Elizabeth, a soul he himself had committed to the flames. He imagined it twisting in the fires of hell, a mirror to the pyre he had built for her on earth. His penance had to be equal to her damnation. His suffering had to be great enough to build a bridge across the inferno. The sun rose, casting a cold, impartial light upon the landscape. It revealed a figure of profound misery, a barefoot man in rough clothes, already coated in a fine layer of dust, his face a mask of grim determination. Peasants working the fields saw him pass, recognizing the fearsome profile of their lord, and crossed themselves in confusion and fear. The days bled into one another, each defined by the rising and setting of the sun. The rhythm of his existence was reduced to the placement of one bleeding foot before the other. The soft earth of Anjou gave way to the harder, stonier roads of the kingdoms to the east. The pain in his feet became a dull, constant throb, a fire he learned to live with. The changing of the seasons was marked on his own body. The sun of summer beat down upon his uncovered head, baking his skin to the color of cracked leather. His body, once powerful and well-fed, began to wither. The muscles of his legs became cords of sinew, the fat stripped away by endless walking and meager sustenance. He did not carry food or coin. He ate what was offered by pious strangers who saw a pilgrim in his wretched state, or he ate nothing at all. He drank from streams and rivers, cupping the water in his hands. He was shedding his old life, layer by layer, reducing himself to the most basic elements of existence, movement, hunger, thirst, and pain. He slept where exhaustion finally claimed him, on the bare ground, with a rock for a pillow. He would collapse at the roadside, under the indifferent stars, and sleep the sleep of the utterly spent. Often his dreams were filled with fire, with the scent of burning flesh and the memory of Elizabeth's eyes turned toward the sky. His faith was as fierce and unyielding as his anger had once been. It was not a gentle, comforting belief. It was a raw, violent force that drove him onward, that demanded this extreme mortification of the flesh. He saw God not as a loving father but as a wrathful judge, one who could only be appeased by a tribute of profound suffering. He prayed constantly, the words a ceaseless murmur on his cracked lips. The prayers were not for comfort or for strength. They were acts of self-abasement, a litany of his own unworthiness. He recited the psalms of penitence until his throat was raw, his voice a hoarse croak that was lost in the wind. Months turned into a year. He crossed mountains where the snow still lay in the high passes, the cold a new and exquisite form of torture for his exposed limbs. He descended into the sun-drenched plains of Lombardy, the heat of physical weight upon his shoulders. He was a creature of the road, his identity tied only to his journey. His feet were a ruin. The skin was broken and blistered, the soles worn raw. Old wounds would seal over only to be torn open again by a sharp stone or a long day's march. He left a faint trail of blood on the dusty roads behind him, a small, continuous sacrifice offered to the unforgiving earth. People he passed no longer saw a count. They saw a holy madman, an ascetic whose eyes burned with a fire that was not of this world. Some shrank from him in fear. Others fell to their knees, begging for a blessing from a man they believed to be touched by God. He ignored them all, his gaze fixed on the eastern horizon. He reached the coast, the great sea, a shimmering expanse of blue that seemed to stretch into eternity. He stood on the shore, the salt spray on his face, and understood that this was but another obstacle, another trial. He sought passage on a ship bound for the Levant, offering the only thing he had, the labor of his emaciated body. The voyage was its own form of hell. Confined in the stinking hold of the ship with other pilgrims and livestock, he endured the ceaseless motion of the waves. Storms tossed the vessel like a toy, and in the roaring wind and crashing water, he heard the voice of God's fury. He did not fear death, he feared only that he would die before reaching his goal. When at last he set foot on the soil of the Holy Land, he fell to his knees and kissed the ground. This was the earth that Christ had walked upon. It felt sacred beneath his hands, charged with a power that vibrated through his exhausted frame. The air was different here, heavy with the scent of dust and spices and ancient faith. The sun was a merciless hammer in a brassy sky. The landscape was alien, a world of barren hills and shimmering rock. His progress slowed, his body succumbing to the brutal heat and the lack of water. He was a skeleton now, draped in sun-blackened skin and rags, held together only by the iron rod of his will. He walked toward Jerusalem. The name was no longer a whisper but a roar in his mind. Every step brought him closer to the heart of his quest, to the place of ultimate judgment. The physical journey was nearing its end, but he knew that the true ordeal, the confrontation with his own soul before the eyes of God, was only just beginning. He saw the city from a distant hill, its walls and towers golden in the afternoon light. It did not look real. It was a vision, a celestial city descended to earth. The sight broke through his years of stoicism. A great, shuddering sob tore through his body, and he collapsed onto the rocky ground, his pilgrimage at its end and its beginning. He returned a year after he had departed, a man remade by hardship. The fierce sun of the east had bleached his hair to the color of old straw and burned his skin dark over a frame of bones. He was gaunt, a scarecrow figure in whom only the eyes remained unchanged, burning with the same cold, unquenchable fire. The lands he returned to were in turmoil. His absence had been a signal for the wolves to descend. Rival barons, vultures who had long coveted the fertile plains of Anjou, had torn at the edges of his domain. They preyed upon his people, their greed a fire that consumed villages and choked the fields with weeds. Word of the Count's return spread like a rumor of ghosts. At first, few believed it. The man who appeared at the gates of Angers was a ragged spectre, not the powerful lord who had left. But the authority in his gaze was undeniable. The penitent was gone, and the master had come home to a house in disarray. He did not rest. The hair shirt was cast aside, replaced by the familiar, cold weight of chain mail. The pilgrim's staff was exchanged for the heavy pommel of his sword. He moved through his castle with a coiled energy, a predator reclaiming its lair. The transformation was swift, absolute, and terrifying to behold. Messengers were dispatched, riding day and night. They carried a simple summons, sealed with the Black Count's ring. To his loyal vassals, it was a command they had longed for. They came at once, grim-faced knights and hardened men-at-arms, their relief at his return overshadowed by the promise of the brutal work to come. He stood before them in the great hall, a stark and menacing figure. He did not speak of his pilgrimage, of God, or of forgiveness. He spoke only of betrayal, of stolen lands, and of the vengeance that was owed. His voice was rust, but his words were steel. A savage joy lit the eyes of his men. The Black Count was back. The war began not as a campaign, but as a conflagration. Folk's host moved with a speed and ferocity that stunned his enemies. They did not march to lay siege in the traditional manner, they descended as a plague of fire and sword, a physical manifestation of the Count's long-suppressed wrath. The first castle they came upon belonged to a baron who had grown fat on Folk's lands. They did not bother with siege engines or lengthy preparations. Under the cover of darkness, Fulk himself led a small party over the walls. The slaughter was swift and personal. By dawn, the castle was a smoking ruin, its lord hanging from the ramparts. This became the pattern. Fulk was a whirlwind of destruction. He was merciless, a force of nature that swept through the Loire Valley. He seemed to find a spiritual ecstasy in the heart of the violence, a release that was as profound and consuming as the deepest prayer. His piety had been turned outward, becoming a divine justification for slaughter. He took no prisoners. Wounded enemies were dispatched where they lay. Those who surrendered were offered no quarter. Their pleas for mercy were met with a silent, stony glare before the sword fell. He was cleansing his lands, purging the infection of treachery with a surgeon's brutal finality. His cruelty was legendary. He made examples of those who had defied him, his punishments designed to sow terror in the hearts of his remaining foes. Traitors were not simply hanged, they were displayed on the highest walls, their bodies left for the crows as a warning to all who would contemplate crossing him. He was the first into every breach, the last to leave the field. He fought not like a nobleman directing a battle, but like a common soldier possessed by a demon. His sword rose and fell, his face spattered with the blood of his enemies. In the chaos of combat, he seemed to find a terrible, ecstatic peace. The flames of burning keeps and villages lit the night sky. The air grew thick with the stench of death and iron. The land itself seemed to groan under the weight of his fury. He moved relentlessly from one target to the next, never resting, driven by an inner fire that seemed to consume food and sleep. His vassals followed him with a terrified devotion. They saw in him a man who had shed all human weakness, who had returned from a holy quest with the wrath of God in his heart. They fought with a savagery that mirrored his own, knowing that the slightest hesitation would be seen as betrayal. The rival barons, who had thought him a spent force, a madman lost to piety, were paralyzed by fear. Their alliance crumbled as Fulk's army cut a bloody swathe through their territories. They had feasted on a sleeping lion, and now that it was awake, they found they had neither the strength nor the courage to face it. One by one, they fell. A head was delivered to Fulk in a sack. Another was cornered in his own keep and burned alive with his entire family. A third fled the country, abandoning his titles and wealth rather than face the Black Count's judgment. The rebellion was not defeated, it was annihilated. Within a few short months, the war was over. Fulk stood as the undisputed master of his domains once more. He had reclaimed every acre of land, every stone of every castle. But it was a scarred and silent kingdom he now ruled. The fields were fallow, the villages half empty, the people cowed into absolute submission. He had quenched the fires of rebellion with a sea of blood. He had restored order through unimaginable violence. As he looked out over the lands he had reconquered, his face showed no sign of triumph or satisfaction. There was only the vast, cold emptiness of a man who found the same release in slaughter as he did in prayer. His name was once again a thing to be whispered in fear. Some time after the last embers of the war had cooled, a profound quiet fell upon the Count. The siege of Saumur had been the final, bloody punctuation to his campaign of reclamation. The fortress had held out for weeks, and its fall was followed by a massacre so complete that the name of the place became a curse. In the aftermath, Fulk walked through the ruins of the captured town. The air was a thick cocktail of scents, the lingering smoke of burned timbers, the metallic tang of spilled blood, and the sweet, cloying odor of decay. He stepped over the sprawled bodies of men he had ordered killed, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He found his way to the small field chapel that had served his army. It was a simple tent, the air inside close and smelling of wax and stale incense. He entered alone, letting the flap fall closed behind him, shutting out the dying light of the afternoon and the sounds of his victorious but exhausted soldiers. Before a simple wooden crucifix, he stopped. The carved figure of the Christ, lean and suffering, seemed to look down upon him with an ancient, knowing sorrow. For a long moment, Fulk stood motionless, a titan of war before the icon of peace. Then, with a suddenness that would have shocked any witness, his composure shattered. He did not kneel so much as collapse. His powerful body, which had seemed immune to fatigue and pain, crumpled to the earth floor. A sound was torn from his throat, a raw, inhuman noise of utter desolation. He pressed his forehead to the ground, and his shoulders began to heave with silent, racking sobs. The carefully constructed walls of his rage crumbled, and a flood of images poured into the breach. He saw the market square of Angers, the pillar of fire, and Elizabeth's face turned toward the sky. The vision was as vivid as if it were yesterday, the smell of her burning flesh a phantom torment in his nostrils. This vision was joined by others, a hellish procession of his recent deeds. He saw the faces of the men he had cut down, their eyes wide with surprise and terror in the final moment. He saw the burning homes of his own people, the women weeping, the children staring with hollow eyes. He saw the bodies hanging from the walls of Saumur. He saw himself not as a righteous judge, but as a monster. He was the greatest of sinners, a man whose hands were so stained with blood they could never be cleansed. The absolution he had sought in the Holy Land felt like a distant dream, a brief respite before a deeper plunge into damnation. His soul, he knew, was forfeit. He lay on the floor of the chapel for hours as darkness fell outside. The sounds of the camp faded, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the whisper of the night wind. His weeping subsided, leaving behind a cold, hollow certainty. The war within him was as relentless as the wars he waged against others. That same evening, he emerged from the tent. His face was calm, but it was the calm of a deep and turbulent sea. He summoned his chief vassals, men who had ridden with him through the blood and fire. They came expecting new orders, perhaps a new campaign. What they heard stunned them into silence. He announced his second pilgrimage. The words were spoken softly, devoid of emotion, but they carried an absolute finality. He would go again to Jerusalem. He would walk the same long road, barefoot and in sackcloth, to beg for a forgiveness he felt he had already squandered. And so the cycle began again. The armor was stripped away, the sword set aside. The coarse, punishing embrace of the hair shirt became his only garment. He left his reconquered lands in the hands of trusted regents and, before the sun rose on another day, he was once more a solitary figure on the dusty roads heading east. This journey was different. The first had been an act of pure, desperate penance. This one was a conscious repetition, the embrace of a pattern that was becoming the defining rhythm of his life. He was caught in a brutal oscillation between sin and repentance, each extreme feeding the other. His life became this duality. He would return from the Holy Land, his body scourged and his spirit seemingly humbled, only to find some new pretext for war. A slight from a neighboring lord, a dispute over a patch of land, was all it took to reawaken the beast. The Black Count would rise again, terrible in his wrath. Then, having glutted himself on violence, he would be seized by an equally violent remorse. The pendulum would swing back, and the warrior would once again become the penitent. This cycle of extreme cruelty and extreme piety baffled all who knew him. He was two men inhabiting one body, each at war with the other. During his periods of piety, his energy was as boundless as it was in war. He founded monasteries and endowed abbeys with the same ferocious zeal he applied to sieges. He poured the spoils of his campaigns into the construction of magnificent churches, as if he could build a stairway of stone and mortar to heaven. He would oversee the work himself, driving the masons and laborers with a relentless urgency. The same hands that had held a bloodied sword would trace the plans for a new apse or a higher bell tower. He built for God with the same obsessive perfectionism that he brought to the art of destruction. He would speak with abbots and bishops, his conversation steeped in theology and the lives of the saints. He would fast and pray with the monks in the very monasteries he had built, his devotion so intense it was unsettling. And then, inevitably, the darkness would return, the need for violence would reassert itself, and the cycle would continue. The lands of Anjou learned to live with this strange rhythm. They had a lord who was both their greatest protector and a figure of profound terror. He was the builder of their most beautiful churches and the destroyer of their sons. He was a saint and a monster, a man perpetually at war with God and with himself, forever walking the road between Jerusalem and hell. The years turned, seasons bled one into the other, and the cycle became the unalterable truth of Folk's existence. He grew older, but the fierce war within him did not abate. The lines on his face deepened, carved not just by time but by the relentless tides of violence and remorse that pulled him back and forth across the known world. He made a third pilgrimage, and then a fourth. Each journey was a repetition of the first, a descent into the crucible of hardship. Each return was a prelude to more bloodshed. He was a fixed star in the firmament of his time, a man whose brutal piety and pious brutality had become a part of the natural order of things. His body became a testament to his life's warring impulses. It was a landscape of scars. Some were from the swords of his enemies, neat lines and puckered wounds that spoke of battle. Others were from his own hand, the crisscrossing pattern of the scourge on his back, a map of his unending penance. His soul, he knew, was similarly marked. He became a legend in his own lifetime. Minstrels sang songs of the Black Count, though they sang them in hushed tones. They sang of his ferocity in battle, the castles he had burned, the enemies he had broken. They also sang of the great abbeys he had raised and his terrible journeys of faith to the land of God. He was a paradox, a figure of both fear and reverence. His people crossed themselves when he rode past, unsure if they were looking at a demon or a saint. He inspired a terrified loyalty in his soldiers and a profound awe in the churchmen who benefited from his violent generosity. He was a force that could not be understood, only endured. As old age began to claim him, a weariness settled deep into his bones. The fire in his eyes still burned, but perhaps with a less frantic light. The swings between sinner and saint became less pronounced, the periods of peace lasting longer. He spent more time with the monks in his abbeys, his conversations turning from war to the nature of salvation. He was approaching his 70th year when he announced his final journey. This one, he told his court, would be his last. There was a finality in his voice that had not been there before. He was not going to atone for a recent sin, but to prepare his soul for the final judgment he felt was fast approaching. He set out for Jerusalem a final time. He was an old man now, his back bent and his step slower, but his will was undiminished. He still walked barefoot, the hair shirt still chafed his skin, but the journey was a far greater trial for his aged body. He leaned heavily on a pilgrim's staff, his progress marked by pain and exhaustion. When he finally reached the holy city, he was little more than a walking skeleton. He had pushed his body to its absolute limit, offering his last reserves of strength to God. But he had one final act of abasement to perform, a penance so extreme it would be spoken of for centuries. According to the tales told by other pilgrims, he entered the city not as a great lord but as the lowest of penitents. He had himself stripped naked, a rope tied around his neck like a common criminal. He then had 2 monks lead him through the winding, dusty streets, from the city gates to the church of the Holy Sepulchre. As they walked, the monks flogged him. The leather scourge rose and fell, leaving bloody stripes on his old, withered back. He did not cry out. He stumbled forward, his lips moving in silent prayer, his eyes fixed on his goal. The crowds that gathered to watch this spectacle were silent, awestruck by the sight of such terrible devotion. He was dragged, bleeding and bruised, to the very entrance of the Holy Sepulchre, the place believed to be the tomb of Christ himself. There, before the sacred stones, he collapsed. He lay on the ground, his body broken but his spirit soaring, and prayed for forgiveness, his voice a hoarse whisper. He felt a sense of peace descend upon him then, a quietude his soul had never known. The long war was over. He had given everything, endured everything, in pursuit of a salvation he had always feared was beyond his reach. He felt that his earthly journey was ending, his purpose fulfilled. He did not remain in Jerusalem to die. He was determined to return to his own lands, to be buried in the soil of Anjou, in one of the abbeys he had built. His retainers, who had followed him at a distance, now came to his side. They placed him on a litter and began the long, slow journey home. His strength faded with each passing day. He was consumed by a fever, his mind drifting between moments of lucidity and delirium. He knew he would not see his homeland again. His life, which had been a whirlwind of motion, was slowing to a final, inevitable stop. He died in the city of Metz, on the 2nd day of June in the year 1040. His final breaths were spent not in confession, but in giving clear, precise instructions for his burial. He, Count Fulk Nera, the Black Count of Anjou, was to be laid to rest not in the finery of his station, but in the simple, rough-spun habit of a monk. His last will was a final act of his paradoxical nature. The great and terrible warrior, the Lord whose name was a synonym for fear and power, chose to meet his Maker in the guise of a humble servant of God. It was the last, desperate prayer of a man who had spent his life caught between the sword and the cross. Centuries passed. The world changed, empires rose and fell, but the Abbey of Beaulieu, one of the great stone testaments to folk's piety, endured. Its thick walls stood against the tide of years, and within its scriptorium, the memory of its founder was preserved in chronicles that painted him as both a fearsome warrior and a revered man of God. In a later, more curious age, a group of scholars and monks received permission to open the founder's tomb. Their purpose was twofold: to verify the historical accounts of his burial and to transfer the hallowed remains to a new, more ornate sarcophagus, befitting the men who had raised the abbey from the very earth. A solemn quiet filled the ancient crypt, the air thick with the scent of cold stone and damp earth. The small group of men gathered around the simple, unadorned stone coffin that had held the Black Count for nearly 700 years. Their faces, illuminated by the flickering light of lanterns, were etched with a mixture of scholarly anticipation and pious awe. Leverage was applied. With a great, groaning scrape of stone on stone, the heavy lid was shifted. The sound echoed in the small space, a sigh from a long-dead era. Dust, fine as pollen, billowed up, dancing in the lantern beams. For a moment, no one moved, allowing the disturbed air of the tomb to settle. They peered inside. At first, everything was as the chronicles had foretold. A skeleton lay within, the large frame and powerful bones consistent with the descriptions of the formidable Count. Clinging to the remains were the dark, decayed threads of a coarse woolen garment. It was the simple monk's habit he had demanded in his final will. But as their eyes adjusted to the gloom, a collective gasp went through the small assembly. He was not alone. Lying beside the skeleton of the Count, nestled against his bones as if in a final, eternal embrace, was a second set of remains. This discovery was utterly unexpected, a stark contradiction to every known record of his burial. The lead scholar, a man of science and reason, called for more light. He leaned closer, his initial reverence giving way to intense professional curiosity. The second skeleton was smaller, the bones more delicate, the pelvic girdle unmistakably female. A woman had been interred with the most feared men of his age. A closer examination revealed something far more disturbing. A young monk, holding a lantern near the female skeleton, pointed a trembling finger at the ribs and long bones of the legs. They were not the clean, aged ivory of the Count's remains. They were blackened, scarred, and in places calcified by an intense and ancient heat. The scholar understood at once. These were the telltale marks of a death by fire. The woman in this tomb had been burned. The silence in the crypt deepened, becoming a heavy, oppressive presence. The sacred task of venerating a founder had suddenly veered into the territory of a gruesome and unsolvable mystery. Who was this woman? And how did her burned remains come to be secretly entombed with the Count? The monks looked at each other, their faces pale with questions that had no answers. The scholars were equally baffled, their historical certainty shattered by the stark reality of the bones before them. They had opened a tomb and found a crime. One of the monks began a careful search of the coffin's interior, his fingers gently probing the dust of centuries. If there was an answer, it had to be here. He ran his hand along the bottom of the sarcophagus, his touch slow and methodical, searching for anything other than bone and dust. At the head of the coffin, nestled between the two skulls, his fingers brushed against something small, flat, and cool. It was a piece of metal, heavy for its size. Carefully, he lifted it into the light. It was a simple, rectangular tablet of lead, gray and oxidized with age, no larger than a man's palm. He handed it to the lead scholar, who took it with the reverence reserved for a holy relic. He held it close to a lantern, tilting it to catch the light. The surface was not smooth. It was covered in a series of crude, deeply scratched markings, the letters uneven and desperate, as if carved by an unsteady hand. The scholar cleaned the surface gently with a soft cloth, his breath held in his chest. The Latin was rough, almost primitive, but legible. He began to read the words aloud, his voice barely a whisper, yet each syllable fell into the profound silence of the crypt with the weight of a hammer blow. The inscription was brutally short, a confession and a testament carved into the soft metal. It read, "Here lies Fulk, a sinner, with his only love, Elizabeth, whom he burned so that her soul, purified by fire from the sin of adultery, could await him in paradise." The words hung in the air, incomprehensible, and then all too horribly clear. A wave of shock, so profound it was almost physical, washed over the men. They looked from the lead tablet to the two skeletons, now seeing them not as a mystery, but as the final act of a story more terrible than any of them could have imagined. This was not the tomb of a saint and a victim. It was a shrine to a monstrous, obsessive love. The public execution, the righteous punishment for an unfaithful wife, was a lie. It was a sacrament. A purification. A deranged act of devotion designed to cleanse the soul of the woman he loved so that she would be fit to meet him in the afterlife. Every part of Folk's legend was instantly and irrevocably rewritten. His endless wars, his violent rages, were not merely the actions of a brutal lord. They were the earthly fury of a man who had sent his own soul to hell to guarantee his beloved's place in heaven. His penance took on a new, more terrifying meaning. The pilgrimages, the scourgings, the years spent walking barefoot to the Holy Land, they were not just for his own sins. They were a desperate, lifelong attempt to bridge the chasm he had created. He was trying to make himself worthy, to cleanse his own soul enough so that God might allow him to rejoin the woman he had so horrifically murdered out of love. The monks and scholars stood frozen, staring into the open grave. They had sought to touch history, to honor a great man. Instead, they had uncovered the secret heart of a monster, a love so absolute and so perverse it defied all understanding. The two skeletons lay together, locked in a silent testament to a passion that had burned hotter than any pyre.